Hello and welcome to today's video. Today's video is a sequel to the video I made yesterday, so if you haven't watched that video, please go back and watch it. The topic of today's video is what the Sensible Centre can learn from the management structure of organised crime. Organised crime and organised criminal organisations have a very interesting management structure that is very effective. I think everybody, any organisation that is being run, could learn a lot from how organised crime and how organised criminal organisations structure. In terms of the Sensible Centre, I'm not encouraging by any means that the Sensible Centre starts engaging in organised crime. You'd have to be retarded to think that I would encourage that. However, what I am saying throughout this video is that the management structures that lots of criminal organisations use, and some of the management structures that conventional and legal organisations use, can be used as inspiration so the Sensible Centre can more effectively organise. Test before you pressure. Many criminal organisations, and to be fair, many legitimate organisations, ensure that their employees are tested before they are given any responsibility. What testing before you pressure does is it ensures that the person who you're entrusting responsibility to is familiar with the tasks and the difficulties of the tasks they may encounter. So if you have a person whose job it is to take public pressure and be a public face of the organisation, in terms of sensible centrist terms, it's important that that person is understanding of what the difficulties of being a public figure are. And it's also important, before that person is made into a public figure, that they have been tested and have already experienced the pressures of being a public figure. This happens a lot with the drug industry. Normally, drug couriers, who are normally children, will be pressured before they are given more responsibility and larger shipments to deliver. It's very common for a child or even young adults who are drug couriers to be offered the chance of more money and be given a task which is already rigged. So it's very common for a child who's a drug courier to be given a large quantity of drugs, and normally they're not actually drugs, and have them stolen by someone who works for the same organisation they do. What this does normally is, if the child is smart enough to avoid the drugs being stolen, that's an immediate pass, but that's very unlikely because the person stealing from them will know exactly where they're going to be and exactly what time and age they are, and be able to make arrangements so that the ability for the child to get away with the drugs and not have them stolen is severely reduced. In terms of the outcome, the normal outcome is the child loses the drugs and they are made to work a crummy job or work for nothing for a period of time. And what this does is it further embeds the loyalty the child has to the organisation, whilst also knowing that that child in the future will be able to stand up to all kinds of pressures. Though I don't agree with harming children for moral reasons, or financial reasons even, there is something very interesting about the drug industry and the techniques they use on children. I would not advocate using anything close to these kind of techniques on children. But what I've noticed from my reading on the drug industry is that these children who are start as street couriers and pass the test tend to become, providing they don't do something stupid and end up with a life sentence, they tend to make their way into the management structure of the organised crime syndicate they work for and become very successful. In terms of what the Sensible Centre could do and take from this test before you pressure system used by drug cartels and criminal organisations, nobody on the Sensible Centre should be allowed to run an organisation without knowing that they can handle the pressures related and associated with running that organisation. So if you're on the Sensible Centre and you're the public face or you run an organisation, it is entirely likely that you will get hate mail and investigations by undercover journalists and so on. If a person has already experienced something resembling those hardships, they're much less likely to either collapse under the pressure and go run off and do something else, or worse still, take money to badmouth other sensible centrists in public. Don't have all your most useful eggs in one basket. I directly discussed this when I was talking about the management structures of organised crime. Essentially, what this is you don't have the people responsible for dealing with money or the money itself associated or near the product. So it's very common and it's very effective for criminal organisations, and to be fair, other organisations too, to have the drugs separate from the cash, and the people responsible for handling those illicit goods in all likelihood will have never met or barely met. What this does is it means that if your revenue team for drug dealing, so your money launderers and so on, get busted for money laundering, they don't know anything about the drugs. And finding a new money laundering team, if you're an international or crime syndicate or whatever, is quite easy to do. Whereas if you've lost your revenue team and your product team, your organisation cannot function until they are replaced, and replacing those people will be extremely difficult. In terms of practicalities and practical uses for the Sensible Centre, people who are public figures should not be organising events and should not be running organisations or standing for office. The main reason is, if you're a really good public figure, you're not necessarily going to be the best person to run a think tank or organise events. Obviously, in terms of public figures organising events, there is a point where that is okay, but I certainly wouldn't want a public figure being in charge of a think tank, because all that needs to happen is the public figure gets their life ruined or their reputation ruined by any means you can imagine, or gets harassed out of the think tank or out of public life. That think tank or policy institute or whatever is discredited and will collapse. For the long lasting and for the health of an organisation and a movement, you want to keep your people separate, your useful people separate, because unfortunately people can turn, people can crumble, people can crack, and if one person has their fingers in multiple organisations, if that person cracks, that will do damage to the entire movement. Whereas if one of the public figures cracks, or one of the event organisers cracks, the movement can still continue. And I think what's important for sensible centrists to know is not only is separating out your eggs a good idea for preserving the movement and the long-lasting goals of the movement, but it's also very good in terms of practicality. Someone who's a public figure does not have expertise in running a political campaign, and they shouldn't, and that's a reasonable expectation. It's unreasonable to expect public figures to be in charge of and have competency where they clearly don't. The separation of function I briefly outlined earlier, but having your organisation's functions separate is very good. It's very effective because it makes infiltrating that organisation much harder. Because if one part of an organisation is infiltrated and there is no way for the infiltrator to move about the organisation and enter different parts of the organisation to gather intelligence, infiltration is not impossible, but it's much harder for people to do. It's important that any organisation or any movement has something in place to incentivise people's loyalty. What I've got written here is, if people are taking falls, give them a soft landing. Anybody who is taking a fall for the movement in a way that is politically productive should be either compensated or at least supported. I'll go back to the example of organised crime. Most criminal organisations, for anybody who is not at the bottom levels of that organisation, will know useful information about that organisation and be able to take more than at least take other people with them if they go to prison. So what happens to an organised crime syndicate if nobody's loyalty can be trusted or banked on? That organisation will collapse. So what happens is you have an incentive and disincentive structure for people who would likely get themselves into trouble or be in the position where they are being bribed for information. You have the incentive, which is, if you go to prison, we'll look after you inside and also look after your family. Then you have the disincentive, which is strictly only for criminal organisations, we'll kill you and your family if you snitch. The sensible centre would never be in a position to kill someone for leaking information, and even if they were, it's immoral and wrong. But there should be incentives and disincentives for people who are either in trouble through no fault of their own, or people who are encouraged and under pressure to become snitches and give information. What I would say here is, everybody who takes a hit for the movement, whether that's a financial hit or whether that's a social hit, the sensible centre should try its absolute hardest to compensate these people and support them. Because if this is not done, these people will be angry and more vulnerable to being coerced or, of their own accord, giving out sensitive information. There should also be a disincentive, which I would say is legally ruining the lives of people who pass on sensitive information to people who are political opponents. There are plenty of legal ways to ruin someone's life or make it so that they are no longer allowed in your organisation and they feel a specific cost for their actions. And I think that should be encouraged towards people who are known informants or known traitors to the movement. If the sensible centre is incapable of using and taking inspiration from the management structures of organised crime, any movement that springs from the sensible centre is unlikely to be successful. Thank you everyone for watching. Please leave any questions, comments, any challenges to my reasoning. Also, check out my links below if you need help with public speaking or something like that. Please check out my public speaking locals channel. And also there's my Substack, which is on legal and political strategy. That's free.